There's a scene in Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film, The Shining, where a man sits at a typewriter in a vast, empty ballroom, surrounded by the silence of a hotel sealed shut for winter. He's typing the same sentence, over and over, hundreds of times. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. It's one of the most disturbing images in cinema, not because of what it shows, but because of what it implies. That somewhere between arriving at the Overlook Hotel as a man with problems and a plan, Jack Torrance had been replaced by something the hotel had always been patient enough to wait for. He came to the hotel. The hotel came for him. Most people who've seen that film assume the Overlook was invented. A fictional place, conjured from Stephen King's imagination to serve the story he wanted to tell. About isolation, about the violence that hides inside the American family, about what happens to a man when every exit closes. It was not invented. King stayed in a real hotel, in the Colorado Rockies, in a building closing down for winter around its last two guests. He slept in one of its rooms and had a dream so architecturally complete that he woke in the early hours already writing the novel in his head. The Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado is still standing. It still takes guests every night of the year. And its real history, the history that existed long before Stephen King ever arrived, is something no film has ever fully reckoned with. The Overlook Hotel is a story. The Stanley Hotel is something else. This is its true history, and it doesn't resolve the way stories are supposed to resolve. To understand what the Stanley Hotel became, you have to understand the man who built it. Buildings carry the character of the people who make them, more than we tend to acknowledge. Freelan Oscar Stanley was born in 1849 in Maine. By his early 50s, he had co-invented a photographic dry plate process that Eastman Kodak purchased outright and designed the Stanley Steamer, a steam-powered automobile that outsold gasoline cars in the United States and held the world land speed record. F.O. Stanley was the kind of man who fills every room he occupies and leaves every project larger than he found it. And then, in 1903, his physician told him he was dying. The diagnosis was tuberculosis advanced. His doctor recommended mountain air, the high-altitude, dry atmosphere that physicians of that era prescribed when they had exhausted better options. Stanley was 54 years old. He had been told to expect months. He traveled to Estes Park, Colorado, elevation 7,500 feet, tucked at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. What happened over the following months, he spent the rest of his life struggling to adequately explain. His breathing improved, not gradually, not incrementally, but in a way that surprised the physicians he reported back to. He gained weight. His energy returned. By the end of his first year in Colorado, he was hiking trails that challenged healthy men 20 years younger. The tuberculosis did not return. F.O. Stanley lived to be 91 years old. He chose to stay in Estes Park, not to return to the industry that had made him wealthy. He built instead. Construction on the Stanley Hotel began in 1907. He installed his own hydroelectric generator, making it one of the first fully electrified hotels in the country. And he built a separate concert hall on the property, acoustically engineered with the same precision he brought to every serious undertaking. For his wife Flora, a classically trained pianist who had studied in Europe. A building constructed specifically for the sound she made. The hotel opened in June of 1909. Presidents came. Theodore Roosevelt. Molly Brown, who had survived the Titanic disaster 3 years earlier, stayed within its walls. F.O. Stanley watched all of it from the billiard room on the main floor. His preferred room, across 30 years of seasons. He died in 1940, 91 years old, and by the careful accounts of staff who have worked in that building in the decades since, interviewed methodically without leading questions, something near the chair where he spent those 30 years has never entirely left. The first documented strangeness at the Stanley Hotel was not quiet or atmospheric. It was an explosion. In the summer of 1911, 2 years after the hotel opened, a natural gas accumulation had been building inside the walls of what served as a linen storage room, the room now designated as Room 217. Elizabeth Wilson, the head housekeeper, entered the room carrying a candle. The explosion destroyed the floor beneath her feet and dropped her through to the level below, fracturing both ankles. She was partially buried in debris before other staff reached her. She survived, and when she had recovered, Elizabeth Wilson made a choice I keep returning to every time I think about this story. She went back. The building had broken her. She had been carried out on a stretcher. She had every reason a reasonable person would recognize to find work somewhere that had not tried to kill her. She went back to the Stanley Hotel, and she stayed for nearly 40 years, through the death of F.O. Stanley, through the Depression, through the war years, making beds, folding linens, attending to strangers who checked out and never thought about her again. Elizabeth Wilson died in 1950, and the reports from Room 217 began. They are consistent across time in a way that makes coincidence inadequate. The most credible accounts come disproportionately from guests who had no idea they were sleeping somewhere famous. People who booked the room because it was available, or because it was simply the room they were assigned. No investment in finding anything unusual. They report the same things. Luggage moved during the night, not shifted slightly, but relocated with apparent purpose. Clothing removed from suitcases and folded. Multiple guests across multiple decades have described that folding with the same specific word, fussy. The precision of someone with strong opinions about how things should be arranged. Personal items found in the morning in organized locations they were not left in. And in the small hours, the sensation of presence, not threatening, not cold in the way horror films have trained us to read danger. Domestic, attentive. Present the way a devoted housekeeper is present, occupying the margins of a space, attending to it without announcement. The fourth floor presents a different quality of strangeness. No guest rooms, only storage and utility space. Yet multiple staff members interviewed independently across decades of complete personnel turnover described the same thing. Children's laughter, clear and unmistakable, from the fourth floor corridor. Stopping completely and immediately the moment someone opens the stairwell door. There are no records of children dying at the Stanley Hotel. No documented tragedy that would account for it. And in Flora's concert hall, the building F.O., built as a declaration of devotion. Guests and staff across different decades, most knowing nothing of the building's history, have reported the same thing. Piano music, deliberate in its phrasing, coming from inside a locked, empty building. Flora Stanley died in 1939. The music has not stopped. In the autumn of 1974, Stephen King was 27 years old and had just sold the paperback rights to Carrie for $400,000, a sum so far outside his financial reality that he has described genuine difficulty making it feel real. He had been writing in a rented laundry room after his family was asleep. The money was coming. It hadn't arrived yet. He and his wife Tabitha stopped in Estes Park by something close to chance. The hotel was closing for winter. They were, by nearly every account of that night, the only guests remaining in the building. They ate dinner alone in the dining room, a room designed for hundreds, maintaining full formality, white tablecloths, careful service, for an audience of 2. King has returned to this image in interviews across 50 years, the hotel performing its own hospitality with complete seriousness, even as it shut down around its last guests. They drank afterward at the bar. The bartender introduced himself. His name was Grady. King filed that name somewhere quiet. That night, in room 217, he had a dream about his young son being chased through hotel corridors by a fire hose that had become somehow intentional. Pursuing a child who was running as hard as he could, every door in front of him locked. King woke in a cold sweat, crossed to the window, looked at the mountains in the dark, and sat with what had arrived, the outline of a novel, nearly complete in its architecture, delivered by a single night in a building he had not expected to mean anything to him. He began writing The Shining within the year. In 1997, he came back. He wrote and produced a television adaptation and insisted, as a condition of his involvement, that it be filmed at the Stanley Hotel itself. Several cast and crew members spoke afterward, with varying degrees of willingness, about experiences inside the building they could not satisfactorily explain. King himself said very little on the subject. Some doors are better left exactly as you found them. The Stanley Hotel has been formally investigated more times than perhaps any other location in the United States. What kept serious researchers returning was not the novel or the film those brought the tour groups. What kept them coming back was simpler. They kept finding things. In 2006, investigators captured footage in the ballroom of a chandelier beginning to move. Slowly at first, then with a directional quality the investigators on site described, visibly uncomfortable, as purposeful. In an empty room with no air systems running and no human presence, captured simultaneously from multiple camera positions. No structural explanation satisfied anyone who reviewed it seriously. In Flora's concert hall, audio captured in conditions where no human voice was present has returned sounds in the register and rhythm of piano playing, consistently, across multiple investigations. But the detail I keep returning to is not any investigation result. It's the guests who weren't looking for anything. Not the ghost tour participants, not the fans who booked room 217 because of the novel. The business traveler who chose the Stanley for its proximity to a conference. The couple celebrating an anniversary. The family who liked the mountain views and had no idea they were checking into somewhere famous. People with nothing invested in finding anything unusual, who found it anyway, in the same rooms, reporting the same specific details, across decades, without coordination, without prior knowledge of what had been reported before them. There is a question at the center of the Stanley Hotel story that Stephen King understood instinctively on a single autumn night. One that every person who spends meaningful time in that building eventually arrives at. Not whether what people experience there is real, but what kind of real it is. F.O. Stanley came here to die. The mountain returned his life to him unexpectedly, completely, and he responded with 30 years of devotion so complete it became indistinguishable from obligation. He built the hotel not primarily as a business, but as an act of gratitude, something he intended to outlast him. And when he died, something near the chair where he watched 30 years of seasons pass did not leave with him. Elizabeth Wilson survived an explosion that should have killed her, returned to the building that broke her, and gave it 40 years of quiet, meticulous care. She attended to strangers who would never know her name, And when she died, something that folds other people's laundry in a room on the second floor stayed. Flora played piano in a hall built by a man who loved her enough to construct an entire building for the sound she made. And when she died, the music stayed. There is a theory, not supernatural in any strict sense, but not comfortable either, that certain places develop a kind of gravity, that the emotional weight of people who loved a specific place completely enough and for long enough leaves something behind that outlasts the body that generated it. Not a soul, not a cinematic ghost, something more like a residue, a pattern of presence so sustained and so specific that it becomes detectable in certain conditions, to certain kinds of attention, as something distinct from an empty room. F.O. Stanley came here to die. Instead, he built something that refuses to release the people who loved it. And in the billiard room on the main floor, in the chair where a man spent 30 unexpected years watching the life that was returned to him fill with seasons and guests, something is still sitting, waiting for the season to begin again. If this one stayed with you, there's another case waiting, another place, another story that doesn't resolve the way it should. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.